Good day, and welcome to Updating Technical Files. Is your company ready for a notified body audit? Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. If you experience technical difficulties joining the WebEx session, please dial 1-866-229-3239, or you can message the WebEx producer using the QA panel. During the presentation, all participants will remain in listen-only mode. As a reminder, this event is being recorded for rebroadcast. We encourage you to submit written questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A panel located at the bottom right of your screen. After typing your question in the space at the bottom, hit the Send button, and please be sure to direct your questions towards all panelists in the drop-down menu. Your questions will not be seen by other members of the audience and will be addressed, time permitting, towards the end of our session. Also, at various intervals, polling questions will appear on your screen. Please take a moment to select your answers and then click the Submit button to share your response. Results will be shared in a confidential format after the poll is closed. Now, I'm pleased to turn the call over to your moderator today, Donna Mitchell-Magdali.
Thank you, Sean. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Donna Mitchell-Magdali, and I'm pleased to introduce your speaker today, Ron Sills. Ron works strategically with medical device companies to review business goals and objectives and offer information management solutions and analysis. Before joining NARAC, Ron was a certified lead auditor for TÜV Rheinland of North America and was responsible for assessing the quality systems and product safety requirements of numerous medical device manufacturers for compliance with EN ISO 13485, the European Union's Medical Devices Directive, and the Canadian Medical Device Regulations. His expertise includes regulatory affairs compliance, quality management systems, design development and validation, manufacturing processes, and marketing and sales strategies. Ron holds a master's degree in biological sciences from Southern Connecticut State University and is a member of the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation. So with that, I will turn it over to Ron for his presentation, Updating Technical Files. Is your company ready for a notified body audit?
Thank you, Donna, and thank you and welcome to everybody who's joining us today. We hope you find this to be an informative session. As Donna mentioned, in addition to working with NARAC for over 10 years, I also spent 2+ years as a lead auditor with TÜV Rheinland of North America. So hopefully that perspective from both sides of the fence adds some depth and some breadth to the presentation today. And as I like to tell people, it's a little nicer being on the NARAC side because in this capacity we're able to provide a little more information and a little more help to clients in terms of meeting compliance with various requirements. So with that, again, this session will be on your technical documentation, updating it, even creating it. When and how do you do that? And on this slide here, what we're talking about are the main topics that will be covered in the presentation today, including, what are the main requirements for technical file documentation? What are the actual documents that need to be included? Which requirements do they match up with, et cetera? What are the key elements as well? When are changes to the technical file documentation necessary? And that's kind of the key point of the session. So when and why and how do we need to update that technical file documentation? As I will mention several times, when you compare this type of documentation to FDA documentation, it's considered more dynamic than static, so it does need to be updated on a regular basis, and we'll cover that in quite a bit of detail today. How is your post-market information and customer feedback used to update the technical file documentation? Your post-market data and customer feedback data, which basically is all part of the same bucket, is really kind of the key driver to the update. So how do you take the clinical experience from your devices as they're being used, and how do you use that information to update your documentation? And very important, how is the maintenance of your documentation linked to your quality management system requirements? Most companies, most device manufacturers, in addition to having products certified in Europe with the CE mark, also have a certified quality management system, typically to 13485, which is the quality system for medical device manufacturers. So it's important to kind of specify in your QMS documents what it is you need to do for the technical file. So having the appropriate instructions, SOPs, et cetera, just like for any other activity of your QMS. In terms of the regulatory requirements that govern any of your technical documentation, of course, this is based on the European Union's Council Directive. So the Council Directive 42 EEC, originally published in 1993, has undergone several amendments over the years, and the most recent one was in 2007. And that included a lot of requirements that really form a lot of the basis for this discussion today. Within the directive, more specifically in terms of what needs to be in each technical file, the annexes 2 through 7 describe what we call conformity assessment routes. So depending on the type of organization you have, the type of facility you have, for example, if you're just a manufacturing production facility, then perhaps you only want to follow the Annex 5, which is for production only. If you're certifying everything from design to your QMS, perhaps you would be better off with Annex 2. So within each of the annexes, it kind of defines the level of detail of how much documentation that you need. Along with the Council Directive are several guidance documents, typically under the MedDev or NBMed, and these are generally equivalent between the two organizations. The MedDev are really written for the manufacturers, whereas the NBMed are really written for the notified bodies as a guidance document. And within each of these, in particular 2.5.1, there are general rules for the conformity assessment, so that will walk you through the various requirements of the annexes and what you need to do. When we talk about technical documentation, there's really two different types. So there are technical files and there are design dossiers. I will center this discussion mostly around technical files, as those types of devices, Class 2A and 2B, are more commonly, marketed than Class 3. In either case, your technical documentation, whether it's a tech file or a design dossier, has to be pretty comprehensive. Of course, the design dossier for Class 3s, like implants, must contain, more information on the design controls and risk management in particular. This is very similar to the 510K approval paradigms. So for 510K approvals, for your Class 2 and, of course, for Class 3 under FDA, you would have PMA requirements, which, again, are similar to 510K, but just bumped up in on the design and risk ends. So when I'm, the title of this presentation and kind of the background, we'll mostly talk about just as a technical file, but of course it applies to the dossier. Importantly, as mentioned at the top of the slide here, the directive was last amended in 2007, and even more recently, there has been some changes approved by the European Parliament, and most of these are centered on the notified bodies. So there's raised awareness and scrutiny on the notified bodies to really enforce, all elements of the essential requirements. And so this is something you'll see as your notified bodies come in. They will be spending more time on your technical documentation, more time in your manufacturing floor, actually looking at and even testing some of the devices. So those changes, which are just being put into place here in 2014, are another kind of key driver into making sure that your technical documentation is complete, it's compliant, it's up to date, and it's being updated on an ongoing basis. That actually takes us to our first polling question for today, and we'll give you a chance to kind of review that. And as our introducer said today, you can submit your responses, and we'll take some time to look at those throughout the presentation and even at the end of the presentation. In terms of this question here, again, it's key to understand really what's a requirement and what's a guidance. So again, legally, I think we know which one that we have to comply with at what level.
All right. While you're answering that question, Ron, we actually just got a question in. The clinical evaluation report was not updated because we did not find any new articles from the past year. Do you have to update the technical file?
Thanks, Donna. Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So in terms of the clinical evaluation report, really any part of the technical file, and we'll get into the key elements in the next couple of slides. Even if you've gone through the exercise where you're going through and looking at clinical literature or whatever way you're doing the clinical evaluation report and you find that there's really no new information, it is important and it is essential to update your technical file, even if it's a letter to file, just to say that, we went through the exercise, we followed SOP ABC or whatever it is your governing document is, and even if there was no new data or no new information to update, then it is absolutely necessary to at least put a letter to file. It doesn't have to be a formal report. A letter to file should be sufficient for that.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to get into what are the key elements of a technical file. What documents, what things really need to be included in a technical file? And again, this all comes out of the Device Directive 9342, and within the body and then within Annex 1 in particular, we have what's called the essential requirements. Excuse me, I went one slide too many. Sorry about that. So let's just back up to this slide here. In your technical file, you obviously need to kind of state which products are actually included or covered in the technical file. So you should have a good, solid product description, the applicable product codes, such as catalog numbers for which from which your customers actually order and identify the products. Your product description should really match other parts of your information within your organization, including like your labeling or your design specifications. Functional description as well, that kind of follows along, and the intended use. And again, this should absolutely follow what you're putting in your labeling as well. So typically, companies will have separate sections, or sometimes it's a narrative that has different headings to where each one of these items is kind of described in detail. All right, so again, product description, functional description, is it sterile? Is it provided, as a single use or reusable item? Sterilization is really opens up a whole new set of requirements. So if you are selling a sterile product, you need to kind of state that. And of course, later on in the tech file, you'll have some supporting information on how you, kind of validated and maintain that process. Your packaging and labeling, including your instructions for use. And that should go back and match what you've stated previously under intended use as well. It's a good idea to actually have copies of the packaging and the labeling drawings. And, usually these are controlled documents on an engineering type drawing. So having a kind of current, or at least a representative sample. And along with that, design specifications. Again, that can be in the form of engineering drawings. Every company documents this a little differently. Some have quite a bit of detail right in the engineering drawing. Some have actual performance specifications to which the device is tested. So any and all of that should be included. Materials, what types of materials are used to assemble the product. Your manufacturing specifications, and that includes even where you manufacture. It's not only the kind of the general instructions for assembly and packaging and so on, but your location. So whether it's your facility, quite often there are sister facilities. Quite often there are facilities on the same campus, which maybe down the road. So you need to identify exactly where your products are being manufactured. Approved subcontractors as well. So if you outsource a lot of your manufacturing, that not only needs to be listed, but it needs to match up with any of your approved subcontractors. When the auditor goes and looks at your purchasing controls, for example, as part of the QMS audit, he will actually go back and match that up with the tech file as well. And even a process flow chart is helpful. Most companies kind of include something like that as a general kind of schematic to kind of show how the products are assembled, right from component level all the way to final packaging. So all that documentation really should be included. And again, within a tech file, each one of those categories, each of the bullets here is usually included like in a separate section. And that's really kind of desirable because quite often one or more of these gets changed. And so rather than revising the entire file, you can go back and revise certain sections. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. All right, so now we get to the essential requirements checklist. The essential requirements are listed in Annex 1 of the directive, and most companies, as an auditor, it was very, very common to see like a matrix set up, like in a spreadsheet, where they would list all of the essential requirements that apply to their devices, and actually even if they don't apply, because within the matrix, what you want to do is kind of show evidence of where you comply with that, either within the technical file or in some of your other QMS documentation. So for example, on risk management, it may refer to the risk management report. If there's a essential requirement that doesn't apply, then of course you could put an NA in the matrix there. So the matrix or the checklist works really well because it kind of forces the company to put everything down and make sure they're accounting for each of the essential requirements. Along with that are applied standards. So for example, again, on risk management or sterilization, where there are specific standards to be followed, those should all be properly referenced. There should be a listing. Quite often, and as part of your quality management system documentation, there's also a list of applicable standards. The key thing here is to make sure your company is aware and maintains the most current revisions. Okay, so if you are referring to the 2007 risk management standard and it was since updated to the 2012 version, then that could be a problem. That'll be a red flag for the auditor. So it's either a case of, it could be something simple where somebody just forgot to update the list, or you're actually not even aware of or following the new standard. Harmonized standards wherever available. Again, this is, we're talking about the European Union requirements here, and so the EN version of standards, in terms of the standards themselves, they're generally identical to just the plain ISO version, but the harmonized standards will contain language and kind of explanation and direct links to requirements in the directive. The risk one is another good example where within the annexes there that were added for the harmonized standard, it really clearly tells you how to meet the directive itself through the use of the standard. So wherever a harmonized standard is available, that should be used and referenced properly. If you're not using it for some reason, for example, on the electrical safety standards, the IEC versus the ISO, again, they're just about identical. But if you're using kind of a sister standard, there should be some rationale as to why that applies to your device and why you're still meeting all the requirements. There should be a section on just risk management itself. And again, this risk is also required in your quality management system, so there's quite a bit of crossover between the two. The key thing here is once you've documented it, and we're talking about updates mostly here today, the risk management needs to be updated on a regular basis with your post-market information. Again, clinical evidence of as your device has been used in the field. All right, so that should be collected and kind of analyzed. Are there any new risks identified, or are some of the risks that you already know about, are they worse than what you thought? Do you have to go back and change the risk level and some of your labeling, perhaps? So this is one of the key kind of key elements of your technical file because it really goes to patient safety. So that's an area where the auditor is always going to focus in on. And it also has a direct link to your quality management system requirements. And again, the standard is referenced here. I didn't put the EN harmonized version, but again, it's generally the same, and 2012 is the most current revision. In terms of the product itself, there should be a section on what we call product verification. So all of the kind of validation tests for various aspects or characteristics or properties of your device or your system. So things like biocompatibility. Again, biocompatibility can be tricky because, biocompatibility for the EU and for the FDA as well really refers to the finished device as it's used in the body. Quite often companies will test components or materials, which is fine, but at some point you need to consider how the whole device is used in the body, whether by testing or even by a risk-based approach. So there should be a separate section there on biocompatibility. That typically doesn't change a lot unless you're changing materials or you're changing an intended use where it's used in the body. So if nothing really changes over time, that's a section that can be fairly static unless the standards change. So, within the past 5 years, a lot of the ISO 10993 standards for biocompatibility actually were updated. And a lot of people had test reports, prior to the revisions. And so you really need to go back and assess whether or not you need to retest your devices to make sure they meet the most current version of the standard. It's usually acceptable to do a risk-based approach to where, and your testing lab can be really helpful with this. They can kind of walk you through. Quite often the revisions were just test methodologies in the lab, and they have no effect on your devices. So they could actually help you put a rationale statement, do kind of like a gap assessment to say, okay, we tested back in 2005, it still meets the 2010 version because. So, but other than that, if there's no changes, that section should remain fairly stable. Things like physical safety. Physical safety refers to the use of the device either by the clinician and or the patient itself. So what are the kind of the factors? Kind of ties in a little bit to usability and that type of thing. Where are there safeguards in place? Is it electrical? So are there electrical safeguards in place to protect the user? Biological safety usually refers to anything that has a biologic as part of the product. So quite often this does not apply. So that could be kind of an NA. But again, even if this doesn't apply, it's a good idea to have somewhere in your tech file or in your summary just to show that you kind of thought about it and documented it, even if it doesn't apply. Electrical safety, again, that will refer to anything that's an active type device where it uses energy in the body. And so there are a whole set of standards that apply there. Software validation, if your system, like imaging systems, for example, use software to capture data, present data, transmit data, is that software validated? And there are certain requirements for that. And again, a lot of times that won't apply, but if it does, you need to include that. Engineering usability is kind of one of the least understood of the requirements, and that really is centered on use or misuse by the clinician. So what factors are you aware of? And part of this is, ties into your risk management and your awareness of post-market information. So how is it used in the field? What are the potentials for misuse? I've even seen reports or even in the risk management where, people make needles or lancets or things like that, and they put things down like, what if the person stuck themselves in the eye with it by accident or even intentionally? So these are all things that need to be considered and documented as part of usability. Finally, three really important elements of your technical file is your clinical evaluation. And clinical evaluation is specified right in the directive. Annex 10 specifically has all the requirements for clinical evaluation. It's either done by, investigations, meaning a clinical trial, or by reviewing and analyzing and summarizing clinical literature, which kind of analyzes your device or equivalent devices for safety and performance. This is an area that needs to be updated regularly. Right in the Annex 10 of the directive, it states that the clinical evaluation must be updated frequently with post-market information. And of course, frequently for this area and really anything we talk about today, or even when you talk about FDA, nobody will ever tell you how often that needs to be done. You need to decide on a frequency, and that should be kind of commensurate with your kind of risk level. There is a guidance that is really a great blueprint an outline for completing a clinical evaluation by the literature route, the MedDev 2.7.1. So if you're following that, if you're doing the literature route and you're following that particular guidance, you will be in pretty good shape as far as meeting that requirement. Sterilization process validation. So if you do sell a sterile product, a sterilized product, you must have a section in your tech file that shows your procedures for how you kind of validate the process, how you establish the process, how you maintain it. It should have a validation report, any of the lab test reports on the sterility, bioburden, all the tests that go along with that. Any of the recognized standards. So again, depending on the method, there are standards for ethylene oxide sterilization, gamma irradiation, steam sterilization. And again, the important thing with applicable standards are you following the most current standards? Along with that, quite often manufacturers use a subcontractor for sterilization. So again, that kind of opens up the whole link to your quality management system requirements for purchasing controls. So are you exerting the proper level of control over your subcontractors? Do you audit them? Do you participate in the validations? How do you make sure that they're up to date, and are they certified as well? So this is a really kind of critical area. Whenever there's a sterile product and whenever there's a sterilized product, that's an area where auditors would typically center in, because again, if there's a sterility failure, it's an obvious patient safety issue. So any of the direct patient safety issues are really kind of hot spots for auditors. Your declaration of conformity is really just it's almost like a shipping document per se. It's often sent out with product to your European, either distributors or whoever does your selling and distribution in Europe, whether it's your own company or a distributor. The declaration is just like it says. You basically declare on there which standards you have been certified to by your notified body. The notified body is listed there and all the contact information. It also declares, which conformity assessment route that you've decided on and that your notified body has audited you against. And it also should have a direct link to the products that are covered. So for example, if this is sent with a product shipment and, the inspector is looking at the product codes that were shipped of the actual product and he doesn't find those anywhere on the declaration, it's kind of a red flag. And it's not always clear that those products have been, assessed by your notified body. So there's different ways of doing it. Some folks put all the catalog numbers. That can get very messy. You could have a very long DOC. Or you can have product families and links to other documents that kind of help to kind of link everything together so that it's clear which products are approved or not. In terms of housekeeping, from a documentation control standpoint, traditionally, most folks put together a tech file as a single document per se, in a binder, separated, section by section, all the sections that I've already talked about. In this new age, we have a lot of electronic copies, which are also acceptable. Hard copy binders are they're kind of a blessing and a curse as an auditor, because you have everything in front of you, but then when they plop down 2 or 3 of those big binders in front of you, you pretty much know what you're doing all day. You're going to be looking through that. Electronic copies, the biggest thing there is to make sure that everything is kind of linked together. Sometimes manufacturers have them kind of scattered. So while in this folder I have the risk, and in this folder I have the clinical, and over on this area I have something else. So it needs to be kind of clear. If you want to drive your auditor really crazy, you could kind of separate it out so much that it takes them longer, but that's probably not a good idea. So make sure that it's all, and not just for the auditor, but just for your own documentation control practices. You want to make sure that it's all kind of together, so to speak, even electronically. Revision control, the whole document itself should be considered a control document under the requirements of your doc control. And again, quite often there's a summary or an introduction to the tech file, which can be a separate document. But most of the sections, I think it works best when people separate them out. So their risk, their clinical, their sterilization, so that as each section is updated, you only have to update that section and not go through the rigor of updating the entire document. So from a good doc control standpoint, I think it works much better when you kind of rev each section. And again, the key is to just keep them identified, whatever the report number is or document number. Make sure you add that rev and make sure it's clear. Quite often, especially in electronic copies, not all the external reports are there. So you might have the section on sterilization, for example, but the newest reports may be located, in another folder, for example. So again, linkage is very important. So again, some companies find it better to keep things separated so that, again, it's kind of the revision control thing where, you don't have to go back and change everything. But whenever you do that, again, if there is an external report, a lab report, your post-market data, make sure that's linked properly. Things like post-market, which are collected for QMS purposes as well as tech file purposes, it's not something you need to repeat. It's all one activity for your organization. So if you're collecting it for your management review, for example, and you have that somewhere in your doc control system, from your tech file, you could certainly point to that area. Because again, you should be using the same data for both activities anyways. And again, linkage to your procedures, I've mentioned that, and in terms of your procedures, yeah, it's actually a good idea to have SOP or a work instruction for how to create and update a technical file and who has responsibility and how often it's done. And even to the level of, certain individual elements. So most companies will have a separate procedure for how they do their clinical evaluation, how they do their sterilization, how they do their risk. And that's a really good practice. It just makes it a lot cleaner for your organization and for the auditor to kind of understand exactly how you've decided to do this as an organization. So moving ahead, so that covers kind of all the different areas. In terms of creating and then having it reviewed by your notified body, again, there's a couple of different levels. So if you're creating a technical file for the very first time, this would be your initial review for the CE mark for that particular product family. Obviously, all of those things have to be in there. So all the elements that I described should be accounted for in one way or the other, even if they don't apply sometimes, like, software, you may want to just put that down that it doesn't apply. This can be tricky if the product has not been made or sold yet. Yeah, so when it comes to a brand new technical file, a brand new product on the market, you obviously don't have any post-market information, right? So it hasn't been out there. It hasn't been approved by the notified body yet, so there's no way of knowing what the customer experience has been so far. So again, that's where it's important to at least have your procedures in place, or if you've done it for other products, you can at least show, here's how we're going to do it for this product. And then, probably the second time around, the auditor will spend probably more time on that just to see, okay, how's, what's the post-market data look like? So that's one area where there's really no way of documenting it if it's the first time around. Second time around, on surveillance audits, and as you know, your notified body will typically come back once a year to go through your quality management system, your technical files, and quite often they will enforce sampling plans. So, if you're a really big company, and I've seen really big companies that have up to 50 tech files, so the notified body will, within the cycle, so if you have a 5-year certificate, within the 5 years, they're supposed to look at all of those, or at least one from each product family. So you never know which one. They usually try to tell you ahead of time which one is going to be looked at. And at that time, or if you're a small company, you only have 1 or 2 tech files, which is often common as well. They may only come back and look at any updates or changes you've made. And again, they will look at things like risk and clinical to make sure that you've at least gone through the exercise and to see what's anything new that needs to be added. For different product families, again, tech files are assembled for different reasons, and companies take different approaches, and there's really no one set rule. you know, when you have a product family that has basically the same design, same intended use, you could put them all together in one technical file. Quite often they have multiple components or accessories or things that are used, and some companies actually decide to sell, or excuse me, to CE mark those separately, because, you know, they could also sell the sterile accessory with another system. So sometimes they separate them out, or sometimes they just consider them all one system. You know, either way you choose, again, you want to make sure that your tech file is created so that it's clear which ones you're covering and how you're covering them. There's even within a technical file, there's, you know, when you talk about accessories, sometimes you have various classes. So you could have a class 2A system or class 2B system, but, you know, some of your accessories might be class 1 actually. And that needs to be clear. You know, obviously, we didn't get into this, but, you know, class 1 are really not even subject to notified body review. But if they're in your tech file, they can certainly, you know, take a look at it. When you're creating your file, again, you could either do it the old-fashioned way with the big old dusty binders, or you can do it electronically. Either way you do it, it's a really good idea to have a table of contents and kind of a description of each section, you know, for each element. That's really, you know, it's good housekeeping for yourself. So, and again, it makes it easier for the auditor to kind of go through, but more for yourself even, just from a documentation control practice. You know, again, each element should clearly define, you know, what the objectives are, what are the associated procedures, applicable standards, of all the, you know, different elements that I went through previously. Again, test reports. So as you update your, you know, your sterilization, your biocompatibility, again, those should be added to the technical file, either physically or at least linked, you know, somehow electronically, so that they're you know, clearly identified. Any of your external subcontractors, testing labs, other services you use, again, those should all be subject to your purchasing controls. You know, keep in mind that, you know, when you're being audited, most notified bodies will be looking at, you know, both your QMS and your technical files. Sometimes they separate them out. Sometimes even do technical files off-site. But even in that instance, you know, if an auditor is doing, you know, your tech file off-site, he's in communication with the other auditors, and he's also kind of looking at your quality management system to make sure everything kind of lines up correctly. Again, current revisions or harmonized versions of standards, that's kind of a repeat of what I said earlier. And also on post-market surveillance data, again, that should be consistent with the same data. And I've gone in and audited companies, and, you know, we're doing their quality management system, and we see their procedure, and we see how they've collected all of their post-market information and how they went over it in management review. And then you get over to the technical file, and it's not the same data. And so that's really not a good practice, and it's really a red flag. There's something wrong in your system there where, you know, you're not really kind of linking everything together. So don't, you know, first of all, don't repeat it. You know, if you're collecting post-market data, then collect your data, and then use it for, you know, your various activities. So it's not something you have to repeat again, but keep in mind that it should all come out of the same data set. So that's an area you really want to be aware of. And again, if it is in a hard copy format, it's always nice to have it together. It makes it easier for you. Some people keep them in a big file cabinet separated by folders, and then they just grab all the folders and, you know, give it to the auditor. You know, either way, it's, you know, for your own purposes, and then for the audit itself, it's nice to keep it together as much as possible. And again, linkage to any of your external documents where necessary. Again, when it's maintained in an electronic format, again, you should have clear linkage within the elements themselves and also to the external documents. Again, things like post-market data are used to update your risk and your clinical. So even if you're just looking at the tech file, if you see where the post-market data was applied, you know, kind of inconsistently between elements within a tech file, that's another kind of red flag. So not just linkage to external documents, but linkage within the file itself. Again, revision control, my preference is to have separate revision levels for each of the sections. Again, that's whatever works best for you as an organization. But either way, whenever it is updated, you need to kind of clearly identify that. And again, your file really should be under the requirements of your procedures for documentation control. I mean, doc and record control are kind of two basic requirements of 1345. So it applies to everything in your quality management system, from design records to technical files. So there should be some language in your procedures that kind of tell you how you do all this. In terms of updating, so when is it necessary to update your file? Here's a few instances here. So whenever new products are added, so if you are working on a design change and you actually come up with a new catalog number, or you're just making some incremental changes even, you should really, you need to update the technical file information. When there's a new product, you absolutely need to notify the notified body. And there will be some assessment there as to, okay, does this really fit in your product family, or does this really need its own technical file? So I've seen that instance where obviously the preference is to try to fit it within an existing technical file because you have a lot of the documentation already in place. But if it's something really new, really different, it's quite possible that they may ask you to assemble a totally separate technical file. Now, any supporting documentation, so if there was a design change, of course, it should be some sort of engineering change notice with approvals and all the supporting information attached, any rationale. And again, any changes to design, manufacturing, so if you change the manufacturing process, distribution, so if you have a new distributor, especially if your distributor is involved in things like post-market surveillance collection, which is quite often the case in Europe, did you kind of qualify and vet that organization, or did they fit under the requirements of your quality system? Servicing, labeling, so any of those things as they change. And again, this is not unlike FDA requirements, where if you make of course they call it a quote unquote significant change, and that's the significance is kind of left up to you. But again, anytime you're making changes, you kind of have to document it and support that. The post-market data is really kind of one of the main drivers of updates. So again, you've got your product approved, it's out in the field, it's being used, so you will have customer feedback, you will have post-market surveillance data. Some of that can be in the form of customer complaints, or even adverse event reports if that happens. All of that kind of comes under post-market and customer feedback data. So that needs to be collected again as part of your quality management system, and then you should be using that to update your risk assessment, your clinical evaluation, any changes to labeling. So again, if you find that there's some new risks, you need to modify and change your risk assessment and change your labeling. Maybe you need to add another warning that you weren't aware of before. Post-market information also includes looking at competitive devices. So if you're looking at adverse event reports, you need to consider your competitors. So what things are happening out there with similar devices that you may want to be aware of. You may need to make some changes there. Products that are removed or obsoleted, this can be a little tricky. If you're still servicing products, you still need to keep post-market data and still collect that. If it's like a dead design, basically, if you've killed off the design and you're no longer going to manufacture it, those parts of the tech file can remain static. But if you're still servicing it, then you still need to at least keep track of your post-market information. So if you're supporting it in any way in the field, that still applies. And of course, you need to update your declaration if anything has been removed or obsoleted. Some things I've already mentioned. So again, it's a good idea to have QMS procedures that tell you how and when and how often you do that and who does it. Again, not all elements need to be updated on the same frequency as we're talking about now. Again, any changes to the design, etc. And again, post-market surveillance is kind of the most dynamic part of your technical file and your overall quality management and continuous improvement processes. Sterilization validation It's typically updated on an annual basis, and this will be recommended by your subcontractors if you're using subcontractors. So that's something you want to look at. Again, a lot of these things are risk-based. So again, if you've had the same design, same process, same sterilizer for 10 years and you've never had a problem and the risk level is really low, you may decide to validate every other year. And that's fine as long as you document it and rationalize it. And so that brings us to our second break here with a polling question. So again, how often must a tech file be updated? So we'll give you a short amount of time to kind of consider that and send in some responses.
Terrific. Thanks, Ron. You know, while we're waiting for people to answer the question, I have another question here that was submitted. Let's see. It says, we added several new versions of an existing product family to a technical file. Which sections of the technical file need to be updated?
Thanks, Donna. So I think the best way to answer that is wherever it applies, particularly on your risk, obviously your product description and you know, kind of your introductory sections that talk about, you know, are you using the same manufacturing facilities, or is this being made somewhere else? Are you using the same sterilizer, or are you doing this somewhere else? So it really can encompass almost every part of the technical file. So it really depends. Again, if you're doing an incremental change and you have a new catalog number, it's probably not necessary to update and go through the whole risk management again. I mean, you should look at it and document, you know, and know even if that particular catalog number is not out in the field, you know that almost the same thing has been out there and you're already aware of the risk levels, and so you may not go through the whole entire exercise again. Even in that case, you want to at least document it. So really, it can encompass, you know, many parts of the tech file. Okay, sorry about that. So let's finish up with a few things on post-market surveillance. Again, this is really probably the main driver of any changes to your technical file, you know, and you know, along with, you know, any design changes. But in terms of customer experience, clinical evidence, you can call it a lot of different things. But you know, all the information that kind of gets back to you in terms of how your device is performing in the field and the safety levels. So again, post-market surveillance or customer feedback can be anything from customer surveys, and quite often, you know, marketing and, you know, product managers like to do that, or even at trade shows you get feedback. Customer complaints, obviously that's a really well-defined area of any QMS. And so anything that comes back and is identified as a customer complaint is going to be handled accordingly, and that'll give you information about the device performance itself. Adverse events, so of course those are complaints, but at a much higher level. And again, you know, that's something where you want to keep track of, you know, competitive devices as well. You know, the clinical literature, so what's being published in studies with your devices or equivalent devices on an ongoing basis. This could be controlled trials, it could be case reports or reviews, you know, even retrospective type of studies where, you know, somebody's gone back and looked at, you know, X amount of studies and kind of summarize some of the data. So, you know, again, all that can be considered, you know, customer feedback data. Even your service and repair data. This is kind of a interesting area where people don't always think about it. You can be getting back a lot of service and repair requests, you know, whether they're warranty or not warranty, and they don't quite fit the definition of a complaint. But if you receive these in a high enough level, it should be a trigger to somebody in your organization that, hey, you know, something, you know, we can probably make an improvement here so that we're not replacing all these in warranty, or, you know, we're not having so many, you know, repair costs and so on. So even things that seem innocuous, and even if it's not presented as a complaint per se, can actually be used to as post-market information to make, you know, product improvements. All of this is, you know, in terms of collecting and analyzing your post-market information, it's all required in the directive and in the quality standard. And again, your methodology and frequency, how often and who's doing it and how are you analyzing it? Is there any statistical methods you're using? That should all be kind of specified in a procedure. Trending. So obviously, trending is really important. You don't want to just take one data set, one point in time, or a small amount of data, and all of a sudden jump into a big design change. You want to look at trending over time. Compare it, over several months or to a previous year, and see if there's anything new, and kind of assess the level of any changes that you might make. Again, the two key areas where this data is used to update the tech file are in the areas of risk management and clinical evaluation. So again, under risk, were there any new risks identified? Any changes to the risk levels of the hazards you've already identified? And as a result, do we need to make any changes to the design, the manufacturing, the labeling? And under clinical evaluation, again, are there any changes in the product performance? One thing not listed here is important to consider: is it still being used as intended? And again, are the safety and risks, consistent with the feedback that you're seeing, when you're going through your management review and your risk management? There should be some sort of, out of both risk and clinical, there should be some sort of risk-benefit analysis at the end to kind of summarize, what's the overall performance? Do the risks, do the benefits outweigh the risks, or is there something that we need to change here? And again, all of this, whenever any of this is done, this is going to be documented in your technical file. So in terms of closing the loop, again, with any good quality management system, there's always a continuous feedback loop of continuous improvement between your post-market information and then tying that back to your technical documentation, specifically your risk and your clinical, and of course a loop or a connection between all those elements in your quality management system. It should be part of a good CAPA, continuous improvement process as well. And really all of your technical documentation, from your technical file to all of your manufacturing, design, and inspection records, it should be a good link with all of that. Because again, your auditor is going to be looking at the entire system. It's not just an isolated, review of your technical file. And again, technical documentation, when we talk about, the European requirements, they are very dynamic. When you think about the FDA's requirements for a design history file, those are a little more static, unless you're making changes to the design. So again, it's something, a lot of companies fall in the trap of, well, we have a design history file, so that must be just like my technical file, or vice versa, and that's really not the case. And as always, be prepared. As you know, as part of the new regulatory framework, unannounced audits are being conducted, especially in areas where they're doing manufacturing. So again, this is something where you want to keep up to date. You want to make sure all your tech files are kind of managed the same way. So again, if your auditor finds an issue with one tech file, the easiest thing for him to do is to look at another one to see if you're making the same mistakes. So whatever you do, do it consistently across all of your documentation. And that concludes my presentation, and I'd like to thank you for your attendance, your attention. Thank Donna and the other folks here who've helped put this together. And now we'll have some time for questions.
Thank you, Ron. Yeah, as Ron just said, we have a couple minutes here for some questions. Let's see. A new sterilization subcontractor was approved for the sterile products in the technical file. What information needs to be added to the technical file?
Okay, thanks, Donna. So whenever you add a new subcontractor, and again, sterilization is a real hot spot in terms of product safety. So there should be information that links back to your purchasing controls that show how you selected, how you approved, and how you kind of monitor that subcontractor on an ongoing basis, whether you're doing audits or you're relying on their own quality certifications. All the new validation reports, of course, must be added to the tech file itself. So again, the most important thing is probably the linkage back to purchasing controls.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I have a two-part question here. Do you recommend including U.S. regulations and guidances on the standards list? And do you recommend including all standards, even those that do not apply to the product, in the scope of the technical file?
Okay. I do not recommend, I'll get the second part first. So I do not recommend having non-applicable standards. Again, companies often have kind of a master list of standards that apply to all throughout the organization, all the different product families and tech files. And then within each tech file, you have your applicable standards. In the tech file, I believe you should only have those that directly apply to those elements. I think it kind of opens up an area where, it makes the auditor unsure whether or not you have a good understanding of the standards that apply, and or it could just be, you don't want to have too many lists, so you just have the master list and you kind of apply it to everywhere, and that's really not a good idea either. In terms of U.S., I guess I mean FDA type of recognized standards or guidances. Again, I would not include those unless it really is the only kind of avenue to which you show compliance. Again, the requirements are, obviously becoming more harmonized, but, the crossover of all the recognized standards isn't quite complete yet. So I would tend to not include those types of documents within the file. I would keep those separate for whatever it is you show the FDA.
Okay, thank you. If you want to extend your sterilization validation from 1 year to 3 years, do you need to notify your notified body in advance of applying new shelf life to the label?
No, that's a really good question. No, I would say no. I hate to use the word major or minor, but that's kind of a small change. As long as you have whatever testing you did, so if you did some sort of accelerated aging or real life testing to support that, I don't believe that's something you have to notify in advance. You should have a pretty good relationship with your notified body. I know it's often adversarial, but again, these are things that you should even consider bouncing off of them if you feel confident enough to do that. But that one, I would not. I would say no. You wouldn't have to notify in advance.
Okay. Based on your experience, who should own the technical file? Regulatory affairs, R&D, or quality?
That's a great question. So somebody's going to win a bet out there, or get stuck with the tech file. Organizations are set up, a little differently. In my opinion, it really should be owned by R&D because they have the most input into the technical file. Regulatory obviously has the oversight, but typically regulatory does not get charged with assembling all the data. They're there to make sure that it's all accurate. And I guess you could tell I've worked in regulatory and quality, so I'm kind of passing it off. But no, seriously, I mean, I think it really belongs with the R&D folks the most because they have the most input to the elements. And again, it's kind of secondarily, QA does a lot of the collection of post-market information and trending and analysis. So I think right up there would be your quality folks that should manage it. But either way, I mean, it needs to be clearly, responsibilities need to be clearly identified within your procedures.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Our technical file does not include a separate report for engineering usability. We believe this is covered in the risk management report. Is this acceptable?
Yeah, again, usability is a little esoteric, and not a lot of people fully understand the requirements for usability. Certainly, a lot of the usability issues or considerations can be included in the risk management. So again, things like user error and misuse and all that. Those are typically part of a good hazard analysis. But there are other elements of usability, especially from the design end, that you want to make sure that you're aware of within that standard. So again, it depends on the level of detail. You could probably include most of it in the hazard analysis, but again, you probably want to at least document that somewhere in a separate section, just to say that we're covering most of this over here, as opposed to an entirely separate report.
Okay, good. Excuse me. Okay. If the results of the post-market surveillance show no risks or changes to the known risks, do I still have to update the risk management report for the technical file?
Yes, yes, and yes. So again, even if you, as I mentioned, even if you go through any of these exercises, particularly for post-market and risk, you really should at least document it. Even a letter to file is more than sufficient, just to say that you did this per the procedure, and here's the information, or here's we didn't really identify any new information, therefore we're not updating this particular report. So it's always a good idea just to show it, even if there's not a lot of meat to it.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. If you have a switch of sterilization processes type without an SAL changing, do you recommend running full biocompatibility?
Can you repeat the first part of that again?
Yeah. If you have a switch of sterilization process type without an SAL changing, do you recommend running full biocompatibility?
It depends on what method you're switching from and to. So, for example, ETO, there's always the issue of residuals. So if you are formerly doing gamma irradiation and now you're going to switch to ETO, I think you definitely need to consider the biocompatibility. Biocompatibility really is assessed on the final device. So after it's gone through all of its manufacturing and packaging and cleaning and sterilization. So if you're using a new process, I think you definitely need to reconsider the biocompatibility test. Again, the biocompatibility standards, you look in Annex B of, or Appendix B of the 10993-1, it does allow for a risk-based approach. So if you feel you could support a rationale that allows you not to do any testing, based on some data or rationale that you have, you can certainly try that. But when you get into, going into a chemical sterilization where there's a residual issue that you may have to consider, you may have to consider retesting.
Okay. Okay, thanks. There's one last question here. Can you comment on the EC pilot program of regulatory submissions of TOCs article mentions in the IMDRF Volume 22, Number 9?
Yeah, I'm not fully familiar with that document, so that's something that I will definitely take offline and provide a direct answer to. So I think we know who submitted the questions, right? So we'll definitely get that answer out for everybody, actually. So I couldn't comment on that one right now, though.
Okay. Okay. We are a new company, and our design history files are not completed yet. Our product is not yet on the market. When do we need to start thinking about preparing technical files?
I think they should be done in parallel. So I think you should be doing them as you go along. So whatever you can document, start putting it together as you go along. Again, obviously, things are going to change, once you get into, past your prototype and into your manufacturing. So things can change a bit, but I think starting to put it together earlier rather than later is a good idea. The flip side of that is, make sure it's complete when it is ready for its first, review by the notified body. Don't expect it to be, looked at thoroughly or passed if you haven't completed, some of the requirements in there.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ron. Please note that if you submitted a question but did not hear an answer, we'll be providing a complete transcript of all the questions and answers to all attendees in the next few weeks. Also, please note that our next webinar, titled In Vitro Diagnostics, Upcoming Regulatory Developments in the U.S. and the European Union, Are You Ready for the Transition?, will be held October 29th at 1 o'clock. Please watch your inbox for registration details. So on behalf of all of us here at NARAC, thank you so much for joining us. We encourage you to contact us if we can be of any assistance in this area. Have a great day, everyone.
Ladies and gentlemen, that will conclude today's webinar. You may now disconnect.